Zeidon Alkinani, who is the founding director of Arab Perspectives Institute and a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Good to have you with us again. Let's begin with the impact that all of this is having on Gulf states. Has this latest escalation convinced Gulf leaders that they can simply no longer stay on the sidelines? Are they still determined to avoid choosing between Washington and Tehran?
It is indeed a very delicate position. I think there's three scenarios that seem to be circulating in the imaginations of the political elites. Two that have always been discussed, a third one that may be very long-term. The main two is being either closer to a deterrence camp. There's many versions of the deterrence camp. It could be diplomatic, it could be going on the side of the US a bit in a much more aggressive way, but it seems like they're much more closer to the diplomatic camp. The third alternative is somewhere in between, given that there are diverse approaches within the GCC front, but imagining a much more stronger unified GCC institutionalized framework to avoid being put in such a position.
Iran is saying that Gulf security and Iranian security are inseparable, but then they're attacking Gulf states. Has that strengthened that argument or completely undermined it?
I think that claim has a different narrative and interpretation that they do not want to be honest about. The Iranians are trying to connect the security existentialism of the Iranian political system and security framework with the one with the Gulf. Iran has been for many decades only been able to conduct its military interventions in an indirect, quiet/silent way through proxies. It now can justify it by protecting its own interests, by attacking other Gulf countries under the pretext of conducting a conflict with the United States.
Two of those Gulf countries, Oman and Qatar, have spent months trying to keep diplomacy alive. Is there still a realistic diplomatic off-ramp now, or has the military simply taken this over?
I think there's another element, which is the necessity. It's very easy to fall for wanting to radicalize one's approach and believing that diplomacy is not relevant anymore. But however, it's very costly, it's very consequential in the long term, which is why perhaps we're noticing countries like Qatar and Oman are trying to provide so much commitment and efforts into avoiding these very heavy consequences and costs. However, both countries, particularly Qatar, have been very open about the disappointment, have been very open about how much these diplomatic efforts can be limited if the Iranian strikes continue to ignore these efforts from the Gulf side.
You talked a few moments ago about the GCC perhaps now moving towards a much more integrated regional security strategy, independent of either Iran or the United States. Is that more perhaps still an aspiration than something that can become an immediate reality?
It may have been an aspiration prior to this war, but I think one main lesson that everyone has learned from this war is that their collective national securities are connected and interconnected in a much more deeper integrated way already. It's just a matter of time to acknowledge the importance of institutionalizing it. Bodies such as the European Union were not founded under a pretext of stability and calmness. It was motivated, such as the UN as well, it was motivated under the pretext and influence of crises that eventually led to questioning the future of their existentialism in a security way, but also in an economic and political way.
And if this is becoming a contest over who sets the rules on the Strait of Hormuz, whose vision is ultimately closer to Gulf interests, Washington's or Tehran's, or do Gulf states reject both?
Well, in the early days, it seemed like the Washington's approach towards the Strait of Hormuz may have been much more realistic to the Gulf approach, but also to the global economic interests. It has been a new card pressure that the Iranian political class and regime has been able to benefit and exploit, which is why many fingers are pointing at accusing Donald Trump for starting this war and allowing the Strait of Hormuz of being a victim of this war. However, it seems like both sides, both the Americans and the Iranians, are asking or conducting a game of relative versus absolute gains, hoping that not even international law and the international legal mechanisms that used to control and determine who and how and when moves around these straits and routes around the world being much more complicated. It seems like both sides are fighting for much more influence and reputation around the strait, hoping to reflect a much more stronger conventional indirect. Iran wants to have a much more stronger control over the strait that never existed prior to this conflict, the US is fighting for its global superpower reputation, knowing that it controls the Western Hemisphere, eyeing and viewing how Chinese regional influence may increase in the East China Sea, knows that this is the last standing point for the US to proclaim being the most powerful country in the world.
Always good to talk to you, Zeidon. Many thanks indeed for being with us once again. Zeidon Alkinani there.